Hello. In this lecture today, we'll be going over the literature of identity. So, first we need to address when the literature of identity first became part of the literary canon, and that's in the postmodernist classification era. This occurs after World War II, and writers began to address different subjects, including previously taboo topics such as sexuality, drug and alcohol use, domestic abuse, and lastly, and probably most importantly, is the sense of cultural identity. And when we see cultural identity, what we have to remember is that if you think about the authors who were dominating the early part of the 20th century, Fitzgerald, Hemingway, Faulkner, these are all middle-class white men who, wonderful writers, but didn't really have a lot of ethnicity behind them. As we move into this postmodern perspective after 1945, we begin to see various and sundry cultural groups coming forward with a voice. African Americans, women, Asian Americans, Hispanics, American Indians. So we begin to see a diffusion of what people saw themselves as within the context of their own cultural identity. In terms of writing poetry, the previous focus on form, following a specific format like a sonnet or an ode or an elegy, diminished, and free verse writing became the norm. Other characteristics of postmodernism include the complex absurdity of contemporary life, the loss of faith in political and moral authority, and a lot of this, again, it's as a consequence of what the world dealt with between 1939 and 1945. It was literally a world war, and as such, people saw the most horrendous things up close, and it really gave them pause as far as who they saw as being the authorities in the world. Alienation from society, black humor and an embrace of the grotesque. They avoid traditional ways to end a story or a poem, and they condemn commercialism, hedonism, mass production, and economic globalism. So all of those characteristics that in large part defined the baby boomer era from 1945 up until the end of the 20th century, the postmodern writers really saw the negative sides of those things. The search for real identity is pointless, as real is based upon time, place, race, class, gender, and sexuality. So in other words, in a postmodern conception, identity is a construct. We all create our identity for the world to see, and often we create different identities for different situations. So, for example, the person you are at your job is probably not the same person who goes out with their friends on Saturday night. The person that your mom and dad know may not be the same person that your girlfriend or boyfriend know. We wear masks, as Oscar Wilde said, for the time and the place of where we are. Ultimately, there is no knowledge or experience that is superior or inferior to another. All cultural experiences that lead to our sense of self or identity are equally valid. So when we look at poetry in particular with identity, we have to remember that the identity in poetry is often called the voice. In some poems, the identity of the speaker is clearly not the identity of the writer. For example, in Patricia Smith's Skinhead, the speaker or the voice is a young white man who identifies as a skinhead who hates black people and gay people and everybody else in the world. Because Patricia Smith is an African American woman, you can clearly see that the identity of the writer and the identity of the voice are two different things. However, in many contemporary poems, the speaker and the writer seem to be the same. And that is, again, when we look at poetry, because it is such an emotional kind of expression, we assume oftentimes that the voice is the poet. But there are going to be a lot of what we call persona or character poems where the poet puts on the mask of someone else to live in their clothes or their skin for a while. The relevant question is to ask who is speaking and then to find the clues in the text of the poem. So why is identity so important in poetry? So much of what we learn is about people who are not like us. People who are a different race, different gender, different religion, different socioeconomic status. And identity-based poetry allows people to see their own experiences reflected and turned into art. There's an old saying that you cannot be what you cannot see. And in that regard, it is an opportunity for people who may feel disenfranchised to claim their voice and understand the opportunities that could potentially be available for them. The reader can find others who share similar experiences and similar challenges. If you're a young black woman who stumbles across Gwendolyn Brooks' writing or Maya Angelou's writing, it could literally change your life, because this is a person who redefined what it was to be an African American woman. And ultimately, it helps us find our own culture. And whether it is a religion, whether it is a race, a gender, a socioeconomic status, your sexuality, we all seek to be part of something greater than we are. So here are just a small sampling of minority cultures that are represented in American poetry. We have women, African Americans, Native Americans, Asian Americans, Hispanic Americans, Islam, Jewish, of course you have Christian and Catholic, victims of rape or abuse, people who deal with addiction, homosexuality and lesbianism, the disabled, people who are poor, political perspectives, the chronically ill and the elderly, and transgendered, and people who are in prison. It really gives a voice to people who fit into the definition of what a minority is. And, if some of these overlap, it's even more interesting. So an African American woman who is disabled is going to have a very specific perspective that is not something that most of us really truly understand. So it's an opportunity to really learn about other people's cultures. This is a poem by Siku the Misfit. It's called The Rapper. And again, what we're looking at here is a young African American, but he's not all the way American. He spent a lot of his life living in Europe. So he comes over here and he is able to see the African American experience through the prism of his own experiences in Germany. And as you read through the poem, it is almost ironic in the sense that he is describing the life of a rapper, but he's also indicting the rapper for the things that he sees as BS. So I'll give you a minute to read through this before we move to the next slide. Now, this poem is by Timothy Liu, who is an Asian American, but he's also gay and polyamorous, meaning he has multiple lovers in addition to his partner. He's a professor, and he is very overt in his preferences, so his poetry tends to be very unique. So this poem, "An ocean is nothing, there is no separation between two lovers, and I knew just what it took. 6 hours, 2 meals with a movie in between, blinders over eyes, plugs in ears as I tried to get some sleep. When I awoke, I knew I'd cross more than a time zone, for my body was always nearer to yours than anyone else's still sleeping in your bed." And this, again, is a poem that is so far outside of many people's experiences with love. We have this traditional idea of, Romeo and Juliet meeting, falling in love, getting married, having babies, white picket fence around a small little cottage, living happily ever after. And the reality is that not everybody wants that. Not everybody seeks that in their life. So, to conclude, identity and who we are is fluid. It's always changing and evolving. The person you are today is not the person you were 2 years ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago. And it certainly will not be the person you are 10 years from now. Events in our lives shape us, wear away the edges, or break us. We are constructed by life. And because we are constructed by life, we change. And as things happen to us, water weareth away the rock. Poetry is a means to record who we are at any given time in our life. So identity within the context of a poem is fascinating because it's a snapshot of who we are or who we see a person as on the day that poem was written. And of course, with the understanding that moving forward, that's going to change. So, that's the end of this presentation. If you have any questions, please feel free to text or email me. Have a fantastic day.